Welcome everyone to Monday Mornings at Maine online edition. My name is Heather Miller. I am one of the adult programming librarians here at the La Crosse Public Library. I'm so glad you could join us today. As we all know, the coronavirus has made us feel more isolated than ever. And today we have a special guest with us, Jen Rubin from the Wisconsin Humanities Council. And she's going to speak to us about the Love Wisconsin project, which has a unique way for us to feel connected with those in our community and around the state. So welcome, Jen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure.
Should I just say more about myself now?
Please do. Yeah,
okay.
We'd love to hear from you.
So I started working as a producer at Love Wisconsin in August. But before that, I've done a lot of storytelling work, both in Madison, where I live, and around the state. If you're familiar with The Moth, which is a radio program on NPR, I produce The Moth here in Madison. And I've done storytelling workshops and family memoir writing workshops around the state. I actually was in La Crosse. Maybe some of you were at that one. It's part of there's a writing group. What's it called? I don't remember what the writing group is called in La Crosse. Anyhow, I was at the La Crosse Library. And so that's just a little bit about me. I teach a social policy class at the School of Social Work, and I wrote a family memoir about the small business my family owned for 80 years. But I started working, yes, thank you, the Great Rivers Writers. Yes, I think that was it, yes. So I've been doing some freelance work for Love Wisconsin, helping putting together some stories, and now I produce it, and then I work with freelancers who are doing the stories. So I have a PowerPoint, because Love Wisconsin is such a visual thing that it seems like it'd be easier to talk about it through the visuals, which then means I'm not going to see any of you anymore. I'm going to share the screen and we'll just see that. So I think I'll do that now. And then Heather, I don't think I'll be able to see the chat, but if you could just let me know if there's questions as I'm talking.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, so see if this works. Okay, does everyone see the PowerPoint? Yep, cool. Okay, so Love Wisconsin is actually started in 2013. It now is a program of the Wisconsin Humanities Council, but it didn't start out that way. The two women who started it were Megan Monday and Jet Weller, who are lifelong Wisconsin residents. And in 2013, I think, like a lot of us, we're just sort of feeling sort of alarmed and sad about how divisive a state we were becoming, and how we were sort of seeming more disconnected from each other, like urban, rural, difference in politics. And so like social media, which, has all this promise of helping us feel more connected. And of course it has, like right now, during COVID, we're able to be connected through Zoom. But it also felt like it was separating us, because we were all only on social media with people who were like us, and they were sort of feeling disheartened. And so they both had been very involved in photography and storytelling and different kinds of things. And they believed in the power of storytelling. And so they were wondering if they could use stories not just to be entertaining, but to help sort of illuminate our shared humanity. So that was kind of the idea behind Love Wisconsin in 2013. And can I advance this? Yes. So, well, that's who we are. So just to give you a sense, so Love Wisconsin shares real life stories about Wisconsinites, and it does it primarily on Facebook and Instagram, and a little bit on Twitter, but then also on our website and through email. And it has attracted a very wide and diverse audience across Wisconsin and outside Wisconsin. I think all told, probably about 150,000 people kind of engage with the stories. And the thing that I think is really interesting about it, which feels unusual for 2020, is the audience is kind of evenly split conservative, moderate, liberal, right? So it's a place where people with different politics come together. So that's a little bit, whoa, sorry, my PowerPoint has a mind of its own. Okay, so that's, again, just a little bit about it. And sort of the idea is that when you read a story about someone who's different from you and you come to it just kind of open to learn about them, you're gonna learn from that exchange. So we're trying to bring about a more connected, compassionate, and engaged Wisconsin, which of course is a lofty goal, but that's kind of what we're hoping to do through storytelling. So just to go back to the history, this was, before I was involved. So Megan Monday, who was one of the people who founded it, she was a photographer. And so she kind of did more like a person on the street kind of thing. So I don't know if you could see, it was like a very short story, just like a paragraph, and the photography was really the main part of it. And so we started sort of building it from there, and that's what the stories look like. But over time, a lot of it was hearing feedback from people, like wanting to know more about the folks. So we moved to this sort of serial text and format, photo format. So each story is going to be like 3 to 5 parts, and each part is published each day. And so people are kind of excited to hear what's going to come next. And you're able to go into more depth about not just the person, but, I think we believe that none of us live in isolation to the context around us, right? So you're able to just, so if you're sharing my story, you're also kind of giving a sense of, well, what's some of like the history around my story, or like what's some of the regional specific things that impact my story, so adding more depth and layers to all of our stories, all the people who are featured. And so chat Heather a question if you have any. So this one was the first serial story. It was like a 6-part story, and you could see here, like they're just much more in depth. And so, so we have a photographer come out and tell the story, and then there's we call him like a freelance producer, like someone who is as good at crafting stories. We'll do a very long interview with the person, and then sort of put that interview together into an engaging multi-part story. And then we match a photo to each part of the story. So again, we're trying to raise awareness, create connection, and inspire engagement. So here's one that was like a very popular story. So Erica Turner, so she lives in Ozaukee County, and her story was, the point to her story was she had founded this organization called Bridge the Divide. And so it was sort of her experience being African-American in Ozaukee County, and like that people were not talking about race. And she felt like that was really important because of what her experience and her family's experience was in Ozaukee County. And so she's this very engaging person. And through telling her story, then we were able to get into the work to do with Bridge the Divide. And people really responded well to her story and wanted to know more from her. And then some stories really sort of dig into the region and the environment and the natural world. And so this was a woman who grew up bird watching, and she became I don't even know how to pronounce this word, like a falconer. I don't know. She trains falcons. And so a lot of her story was sort of about bird watching and what kind of natural world is needed, for successful bird watching. And then some of the other things we do is particularly when a story really resonates with people, we then try to go to like another level, which is having engagement outside of just sharing the stories. So sometimes I do this thing called community conversations, where people can sort of join this group, and together in real time, they're talking, not verbally, but through typing, I suppose, with a featured storyteller. So we had Jim Leary, who is a bookstore owner and a folklorist. So that was a community conversation. But then sometimes, and over here on the right side, Corey Staffold, who is an African-American police officer, and his story very much talked about his experience as a young man with police and how he was treated, and then him deciding to become a police officer, and then what his experience is as a Black police officer. And so people really interested in talking to him. So we did a Facebook Live event where people could like actually talk with him, in real time. So we do that from time to time, depending upon what kind of response we get from a story and how comfortable the featured storyteller is doing that kind of thing, right? That's not everyone's comfortable doing that kind of thing. And so I think I mentioned this briefly, but I'll talk a little bit more about how we choose our stories and we craft our stories. We have sort of 6 themes that we're interested in. One is stories that are about community. One is stories that are about sort of our land, like our shared land, like this, this beautiful resource of Wisconsin. Stories that really touch at creativity or traditions in Wisconsin, resilient voices, and then adventure. So if a story doesn't really fit into one of those themes, we might not go with the story, depending. And then here's just kind of a range of some of the stories. So how Love Wisconsin really started is making sure that we have a professional photographer for each story. Because, I mean, as you can see, when you have a professional photographer, the photos are just engaging, right? And so since we're mostly doing this over social media, that's kind of what draws people in. So these are just some examples, of the photographs for the stories. And then I'll take you a little bit through the process. These are 2 stories that I put together. So you might recognize her. It's Jessie Garcia. She was a sportscaster, mostly in Milwaukee, and she actually was like the sideline sportscaster for the Green Bay Packers for I think like 10 years. And so a lot of people were familiar with her and knew her. And so I think this was a 4-part story. So you could see along the side, some of the comments people were making. And so often what we do with stories is we'll sort of start out a little bit with the person's childhood before we sort of get into what they're doing as an adult. And so hers was, so she grew up in the 1970s in Madison, and she was a child of a single mom in the 70s. And she talked about how like there was all these single mothers together. They all sort of formed like a group where they kind of watched each other's kids. And so she was sort of raised just assuming girls can do anything. It didn't occur to her that she couldn't. And so she talks about how that was sort of an important part of why she felt like she could be a female sportscaster, even though there hadn't been one before, at least not in Madison. Excuse me. So we start usually with that kind of thing, because that's something that sort of sets up for where she ends up. And then we sort of, in this one, like we talk about her work as a sportscaster, what it was like as a young woman breaking into this field. And there was a lot of interesting things to say about that. So that, that was our second post. And then, because she spent 10 years as a Packer sportscaster, like people wanted, she had fun stories about Brett Favre. Like she was there for those years, the Brett Favre years, which were, great years. And so we made sure we added, some anecdotes about that in the third part. And then the fourth part, she really sort of circled back to what it feels like to be a mentor and a role model for young women. And so to circle back to that. So, that's kind of how we shape our stories. But this one, and I'm assuming some of you know this person because he's from La Crosse, and the way he describes it, between him and his wife, they're related to most of La Crosse. So we featured Terry Collins. I don't know if anyone here knows the Collins family. So he's from La Crosse, and the reason, so I know him because I'm good friends with his daughter, Mary Beth, and actually, I guess last summer was already. It's hard to keep track of time with COVID. So the summer before last, I had a chance to go out on the Mississippi with him, and he grew up on the Mississippi, and he knows every inch of the Mississippi, and he spent a lot of time talking about these kind of working class cottages, and he'd been involved in sort of historic preservation of them, which I just thought was super interesting. So so I did a feature on him, and so the thing that I, I thought was interesting about his story is, you know, and this might be true for many of you, like he grew up at a time that doesn't really exist for our children or grandchildren in the same way, where you had just tremendous freedom as a, you know, you could be out on the Mississippi, you know, on your own with your siblings at 11 years old, you know. And he also talked about how he was from a family of 11 or 12, and how at the time the pathway, you know, for he grew up in a working class family, the pathway for his brothers, which is what he knew he would follow, was that join the army after high school, serve in the army, and then go to college on the GI Bill, you know, which is the course he took. So, you know, I always, like I said earlier, I like, through telling people stories, to sort of show some of the context behind the story, you know, kind of how, what helped shape your life. So we sort of start off there. And then he got to talk about some of the legal work he did, and how he, I don't remember the name of it, but he represented people who worked in a brewery that had all lost their jobs. And he got to talk about how he's sort of like a neighborhood attorney. And then all this community service he did, you know, we then sort of talked about how he ended up being, I think this maybe 5 or 6 years ago, a fest master, you know, at the Oktoberfest. And then, but at the end, we sort of circle back to the Mississippi River and the historic preservation work he's done for these cottages, and sort of gave the history of why they were built in the first place and what their role played. So anyhow, so those are just two examples of what we do with our longer stories, which are sort of the more traditional stories that Love Wisconsin has shared. A professional photographer comes, it's a multi-part story. But we are now in COVID-19, right? Which is hopefully a very unique time. And so we really wanted to share some snippets of, well, what is life like for all of us right now? And so these are shorter stories. These are just like 1-part stories. And we're not sending out professional photographers for these 1-part stories. First of all, it's just too expensive, and doesn't really make sense to do that. And a lot of people, even if you're outdoors, are not really interested in strangers showing up and getting close to them, you know, during COVID-19. So people send in their own photos, which is great, but they're not, you'll see the difference. Like they're just not, the quality just isn't as good as the photos. So I'm going to share our 3 most popular ones. So this woman, she lives, her daughter lives in Stevens Point, but I think she lives in Manitowoc now. So I think she's 95, 96 or something. And she was never able to, she never got her undergraduate degree, but she had, you know, I think she was in college, and then she had to drop out and support her husband during the war, and then she had kids and things just happened. But she had taken enough courses like over the years, and her daughter had sort of figured this out. And so she got in touch with the chancellor at Stevens Point, and they realized like she had enough for the degree. But she couldn't, you know, she's not leaving her home, you know, during COVID. So actually like the chancellor like drove to her home, and they got people from her church, and they did a motorcade drive-through, and she got to get her diploma, you know. And so so this was a very popular story, and this is a photo that her daughter shared. And then this is another one that was very popular. It's a woman up in Lac de Flambeau who you know, I think was feeling like a lot of us. I think she was feeling pretty depressed and isolated, and so she decided to start making masks for the community, and so she's really sort of become like the mask maker for her for her community, and it was another very popular story. And then excuse me, this was another one. He's I don't remember the name of the town, but he's from a small town in Wisconsin, and he's a teacher and he's a football coach. And he was just, this was in the early days of COVID, and he was just talking about what it was like transitioning to you know, remote the remote learning and what it was like, what he was missing and what his students and his team was missing. And this was also one of our more popular ones. So this is our COVID series. We probably have about 20 of them now. And then, oh, this was another one, another very popular one. So this woman, she is studying English through a literacy network. And she sort of was talking about how she and the person who she works with in the literacy network, they've been meeting every week over Zoom, I guess, to keep going with the English lessons. That's her and her family. But another thing we've been doing more recently is, heading into the election, and obviously, no matter what your opinions are and who you want to have win, it's a very fraught election for all of us. Like, we are all on edge. Feels like a very high stake election. And I've been a poll worker, maybe some of you have been as well. I've been a poll worker for over 20 years. And I think if you've been a poll worker, it's sort of frustrating to hear all the misinformation out there about how votes are counted. Because if you've been a poll worker, you know about all the safeguards that go on, and that poll workers are just people in the community. So we thought, well, what if we do a series on poll workers? And so we found poll workers from big cities, small towns, people have been poll workers for a very long time, people who are newer poll workers, and just thought, well, let's just tell the story of what it's like to be a poll worker, why people choose to be one, and what it is you do as a poll worker. So we did a 2 weeks, so we had 10 of them. So here's 2. So I'm not very good at putting in the PowerPoint slides, so their faces look very large right here. But so Leanne is like the head poll worker in Lac du Flambeau in Vilas, and then Marlene, she counts absentee ballots in Beloit. And then these were 2 younger poll workers who, so Heather actually is from La Crosse also. As she started being a poll worker because her parents had been poll workers and they weren't going to do it because of COVID. So she kind of she filled in April and August. And then Wilson is a younger poll worker in Sheboygan. And again, they're sending in their own photos, so they're not, the same quality level. And then the other thing we do is we just try to also just do sort of fun, beautiful photos of Wisconsin. And so we'll just sort of share them with like a pithy thing, about the bounty and beauty of Wisconsin. So we share some of that kind of thing too. Yeah, so let's see. All right, so the other thing I want to share here, I'm going to stop this. And I'm going to just, let's see. Can I find it? Let's see. Well, why don't I see if there's any questions, and then I just want to share our website, because we have all these stories up on our website. Probably once every week or 2, we send out an email. If you sign up to get emails from us, we'll let you know, oh, we have a poll worker series coming out right now, or whatever it is we have coming up. We'll share that over email. And then if you're someone who's on Facebook, you could just follow us on Facebook. So let's see. I'm just going to try and share. Should be able to share this. There it is. So on our website, whatever our most recent long story is the first thing you see, and then you could search by our theme areas. Then our 3 most recent long stories that we shared are next, and then we'll sort of share like a series. Like, so here, if you want to see all our COVID stories, you could click here. If you want to see all our poll worker stories, you could click here. And then these are stories that are connected to the Humanities Council. So these 3 people, maybe they got a grant from the Humanities Council for the work they've done. And then if you want to get an email from us, you just enter it right here, and then you'll get emails from us. So that is what Love Wisconsin is. So does anyone have any questions for me? And you're muted, so if you have, I'm not hearing it.
Can people still submit poll worker stories?
You
Are you
know,
finished with that?
what'd you say?
Are you finished with that?
Well, so, I'm not sure what we're gonna do, but why don't you, here, I'm gonna put my email in the chat. Why don't you email me? Because maybe after the election, first of all, for all we know, we're gonna be counting ballots for weeks. Like, we don't know what's gonna happen. So if that's happening, then like I might want to share more poll worker stories. So here, that's my email, and why don't you just get in touch with me?
Okay, my
Another, oh, go ahead.
wife is the chief poll worker here in La Crosse, and so this last election, which we call the election from hell, because of COVID,
Yeah.
was quite an experience. But anyway, I ended up writing an essay about her job as chief called True Leadership. So I don't know if you'd be interested. I can send it to you. You can look
Yeah.
at it.
Yeah, please do. Please do. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because the other thing I didn't mention, but one thing that I'm interested in, over time. Oh, I see your question about funding, Sandy. I'll get to that in a minute. Is what was I going to say? Oh, I'm also interested in stories about people who, I feel like there's also just a lot of misunderstanding about our public institutions. I should mention that we actually did a story last Friday about Dawn, who works at the La Crosse Public Library. So I think people who carry our mail or keep our libraries going, or anything that kind of upholds our public institutions. Like, so if you have ideas of anyone who might be a good fit for those kind of stories, definitely let me know, because I'm interested in that.
Okay, I'll email you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. So how are you funded? I have to say, so I've worked at Love Wisconsin since August, and I'm realizing I probably should have expected that question, kind of a clear answer. But so some of our funding comes from the Wisconsin Humanities Council, because we are now a program of the Wisconsin Humanities Council. And I don't fully know how the Wisconsin Humanities Council is funded. Some of it is state money and some of it is grants. And some of it comes from the National Humanities Council, which I assume is funded federally. I don't know. And then some of the Love Wisconsin funding comes from separately from the Humanities Council from grants. But I actually I don't remember who to say. And I will, that is something I should know. So, but I don't have a good answer other than that. Any other questions?
Do you have a favorite story you can share with us, Jen?
Well, so I mean, it's easier for me to talk about the stories that I've been a part of. I've read many of the stories, and there's so many great ones. But I've loved interviewing Jessie Garcia and putting her story together. Like, she just has, just from her childhood and how that connects to the work she does, and just all of her anecdotes from working with the Packers and being a mentor. Like, that was just really fun. And if you're inclined to kind of search through some of our stories, I recommend that, like, looking hers up. I think it's a fun story. Of the COVID stories, I mean, I really love the ones I shared with you, but there's this young man, his name is Simon, and so he's a young guy. So what is he? He's probably like, I don't know, maybe he's 23 now or something. So he was sort of a star baseball player in high school, and he got recruited in college. He played baseball in college, but then his dream was to play baseball professionally. And so he left college, I think his junior year, because he got drafted into the minor leagues. So of course, in the minor leagues, most people never make it out of the minor leagues. It's a long slog. So he was in March or in February, whenever it was, he was out in Florida for spring training. He gets a phone call saying, we want you to tomorrow, we want you to show up, to, I don't know the word for it, but like, he was going to get to pitch against a professional baseball team for spring training, which is sort of the dream. And then the next day, so he hardly sleeps, he's so excited. The next day, then the word comes down that they're shutting down the season or suspending it due to COVID. So it's like, so anyway, but his story about like how, so he didn't know where to go, right? Because at that point they didn't know if was baseball a super spreader. This was back in March or whatever it was. No one knew. His dad was living with his elderly mother, so Simon's grandmother. So he couldn't go stay with them because they didn't know if he was contagious. So he went and moved in with his aunt and uncle in the attic. And they talked about how they use like bags of kitty litter to rig up a workout room for him so he could try and stay in professional baseball shape, you know, from his uncle. Anyway, I really enjoyed talking to him. That was an interesting story. And it's a reminder just like how different, like how confused we all were then, you know, like just because everything was changing daily. So
That's great. Thank you for sharing. Does anyone else have any other questions for Jen?
well, I hope you check out the stories. If you have ideas for stories, I hope you get in touch with me and let me know. And if you're someone who likes having emails show up every once in a while with interesting stories, just sign up for that. And hope you'll have a good day.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And again, if you like stories, next week we also have storytellers are going to be joining us from the Bluff County Tale Spinners. So they'll be featuring some Gothic ghost stories. So perhaps you can join us next week. So thanks again for joining us. And thank you, Jen, so much for telling us about the Love Wisconsin project. We really appreciate it.